Chapter 4: The Ted Rice Story. What follows was reconstructed from Carla Turner's seminal book, Masquerade of Angels. I have decided to place Ted's story first because his experiences incorporate almost every experience I saw in my research. In essence, Ted is the poster boy for the thousands of abductees who have not yet come forward. Ted's first alien encounter took place at 4 years of age while he spent the night with his grandmother, who, 4 years afterwards, was afflicted by a deep sense of guilt because she felt she could not protect her grandson from his visions and nightmares. At age 8, Ted went through one of the most horrific alien abduction experiences on record. This almost unbelievable event remained deeply submerged in Ted's subconscious, until he stepped out of the shadows to tell his story. The boy often walked through the open fields near his grandmother's home in Arkansas. One day, he noticed a bright light off in the distance. The next thing he knew, the light levitated him up into a large metallic craft. Paralyzed, Ted found himself in a strange room with 3 small, chalky, angular-faced creatures, with teardrop-shaped black eyes, as if they were covered with dark sunglasses. Confused, Ted asked, "Who are you and where am I?" The beings made no response, but he soon began to understand telepathically. The Greys guided Ted to a sitting area where he could see out a window. He saw his grandparents' farm below, getting smaller and smaller. He realized they were traveling up into the sky away from Earth at a great speed. They approached a dark gray-green metallic-looking orb out in space. The orb was huge and had spiky protuberances sticking out of it. Lights entered and exited the spikes. As he observed closely, he saw that the lights were UFOs coming and going from this large orb. The inside of the orb was spacious, and light beams stretched from point to point across the interior. Ted saw many different beings traversing the light beams as if they were walkways. Ted's alien escorts led him into an examination room, which contained a round metallic table. It was raised several feet from the floor and featured a curved footrest. He was directed to sit against the metal pallet with his feet on the rest. A female alien who was dressed in a white lab coat entered the room. She seemed theatrical to Ted. Her lips were painted with bright red lipstick, and she sported burgundy red hair, which Ted thought was probably a wig. The controller ordered Ted to remove his clothes, which he refused to do. Ignoring his requests, the dolled-up scientist gave an order and the attendant aliens forcibly undressed him. Naked, but strangely not cold, he was marshaled to a large set of screens where many lights pulsated. The aliens operated these screens as a type of X-ray or MRI machine which gave the aliens a full-color picture of Ted's internal organs, as if there was no skin or bone. Next he was taken back to the metallic plate, which was tilted on a slight oblique angle. The Greys forced him to don a set of headphones. Noise came from the device, pleasant at first, but gradually increasing in pitch, tone and decibels, until the sounds passed the pain threshold. His reactions were noted. While relaxing and trying to recover from the ear-bursting cacophony of the experiment, and hoping the aliens would not hurt him, one of the Greys came towards Ted with a glass of green glowing liquid, which he was commanded to drink. Ted tried to resist, but he was compelled to swallow the fluorescent liquid. Within seconds he became nauseated. Pain flared up as if his insides were on fire. He vomited and remembers seeing globs of green liquid flowing down his face and chin. The drink must have contained some kind of drug, because in a few seconds Ted found himself floating motionless above his body. "Am I dead?" he wondered. Then something cloudy and formless began to rise up from his body. The mass slowly coalesced into an image of himself and he saw that it was attached by a bottom tendril to drops of the green glowing liquid on his face. "It's my soul," Ted thought in amazement. Displaced from his pain, Ted sensed pure love and total forgiveness toward the aliens. As he hovered above, fully conscious, the woman went over to a nearby counter to retrieve a rectangular metal box, which she carried back to Ted's nude body. With a single motion she turned his body over, placing the box near Ted's shoulder. A spirit image of Ted, in miniature, was slowly transferred into the box. Next, the alien doctor used a drill-shaped instrument on Ted's head and neck, and with that his memory began to fade. He watched intently, in and out of, the body state as the woman moved it down the nape of his neck. He could do nothing to stop her, but he felt no pain. With the light beam she quickly severed the head from his body and placed it in a basket-sized container on the floor. The table tilted slightly, allowing blood from the headless body to flow into a vat. Note: the following paragraphs may explain the numerous reports of eviscerated bovine carcasses found in the Southwest over the past several decades. Ted's mind went completely blank. Hours, even days may have passed. The next thing he remembers, he was looking down on row after row of short tubs. He heard a surging sound similar to a large pump, which pulsated in the tubs. The containers were filled with dark red liquid in which chunks of fleshy tissue floated. These chunks looked like bovine genitalia, things he had seen on the farm before. One of these tubs opened, releasing a placenta-like bubble. The alien beings picked up this substance and rinsed it in a nearby sink. Once washed, Ted could see that it was a real human fetus. Each of the tub-like compartments contained embryos in various stages of development. One of the aliens, a gray, went to a short cabinet in a locker area, opened the door and placed the baby inside. Another gray activated a control on the locker and a few moments later opened the door again. It rolled out what looked like a small wind tunnel contraption. Within it was a tray, and on the tray Ted saw a body, identical to his, completely naked. His clone. The aliens moved the cloned body over to the tilted table, now empty, and placed it on the metal surface. Then the red-haired woman brought back the mysterious black box and set it on the cloned body's chest. Ted saw himself reconstructed as his consciousness remained in suspended animation. He saw the body begin to suddenly jerk in short spasms. The chest began to rise and fall, now breathing. Ted's alien handlers next drilled a hollow needle into his left heel, chest and the back and top of the clone head. Later experts interpret this procedure to be a form of implant insertion. They also put drops into his eyes, which later caused them to burn. One of the Greys brought the red-haired woman the headphone device again. Once activated, Ted became vaguely conscious of his memories and feelings. Basically, he came back to life, but was it his, or was he now inhabiting the body of his clone? Were the aliens trying to improve him, perhaps ridding him of disease, or were they planning to use him in an orchestrated scenario? We will probably never know. The headphones continued to generate soothing sounds and Ted became acutely aware of himself within his new body. Now Ted remembered everything he had thought and felt as a child, as if the information had been downloaded into the new cloned body he now inhabited. After this procedure, Ted was escorted to another room where a pale, and very thin, human awaited him. Another figure entered the room, a tall Nordic with kind eyes. He told Ted about what had been happening, the lockers and procedures done. The Nordic explained to him that he would be able to instantly absorb this information. He explained that there were periodic changes in the evolutionary process of the original Ted, and that from time to time, such a switching out procedure would be necessary. He would be contacted when those intervals were reached. The Nordic mentioned that something had been done to Ted's mother and that the genealogical structure of both his parents had been used along with something else. Note: what happened next must be outlined before the reader can fully understand Ted's journey, and remember this entire episode began in the 1950s, long before George Lucas created the barroom scene in the original Star Wars, a scene which has become a near cliché on the various Star Trek television shows. After the short briefing, the Nordic took Ted to a stage-like area where there were creatures of various types seated in an auditorium. Ted described hairy, Bigfoot creatures, half-ant, half-cockroach-like beings, small greys, Nordics, insectoids, and reptilian types in the audience, as if they were working together, and all in agreement, under one umbrella. The pale man who had now donned a purple surplice and a satin cowl. Priest's robes. Ted thought. This robed man led two other small children, a boy and a girl, onto the stage. The alien with the makeup and wine-colored fright wig took a position next to Ted. The Nordic man picked up Ted in his arms and held him out for the audience to see. He placed Ted down after several seconds and proceeded to hold up the other two children in turn. No conversation took place between the three children. Ted sensed that the audience approved of the experimental children. The Nordic man addressed the audience, speaking of future generations. On a screen behind him, images flashed showing the before and after products of the procedure Ted had just been through. The Nordic man explained that these children were the beginnings of products of future generations on Earth. Ted woke up in the field next to his grandmother's farm several hours later. A tornado hit his grandparents' home and uprooted some trees, but luckily Ted was not injured. His uncle, who was home at the time, watched the tornado and saw that there were many different colored lights and glowing places within the vortex. Ted believes that the UFO was hidden inside a cyclone or created it as a diversion. Ted's second abduction. For the next several months Ted complained of cramps and pain in his abdomen. He contracted several of his childhood diseases again, even though he should have been immune to them. He came down with different types of flu and did poorly in school. After his abduction, which he felt he could not share with anyone, he began the cocooning process. A year after the tornado, Ted could not recall the abduction, but suffered from post-traumatic stress symptoms, headaches, anxiety attacks, panic attacks, all symptoms of suppressed traumatic material. At 10 years old, Ted had another terrifying alien abduction with his grandmother while she was visiting him at his home, which was located several counties away. Ted's parents were completely unaware of these events and continued the daily chores. This experience, occurring on top of the already repressed material, caused Ted to have many problems later in life, interpersonal and sexual difficulties, that, in retrospect, may have been deliberately conditioned by the aliens. Here again we see a classical etiology of the emotional love bite, as directly linked to aggressive skin and bodily penetration in the form of needle injections, scoops, probes and other surgical techniques. 2 days after his nightmarish second abduction, with the aid of hypnosis, Ted recalled the events, which preceded his grandmother's sudden death. He remembered seeing his grandmother standing on a footstool while several creatures removed her nightgown, replacing it with a white gown, making her look beautiful. Grandy, Ted's affectionate name for his grandmother, appeared hypnotized as the creatures used something like a drill touching the back of her head. This was most likely the insertion of an implant. An instrument similar to the instrument he had seen used years earlier when he floated above his body. They had done something to her, telling her she is coming to live and work for them. Ted sensed the falseness in their behavior. Grandy complained about pain and seemed to be arguing with the creatures about her human rights. A reptilian creature tells Grandy that they can exchange information on herbs and healing and that Grandy could try some of their stuff. She took a yellowish clear substance which the aliens put under her tongue. The reptilian tried to coerce Grandy into curing sick people with herbs and special healing powers, but she refused to participate because it wasn't for the right reasons. The aliens told her that someone will come and teach her more someday soon. The aliens then brought in a male figure, telling Grandy that it is her dead husband so she could join with him. But she knew it wasn't Ted's grandfather because he had been dead for at least a decade. She continued to be argumentative and churlish with the aliens. Ted saw that the figure was really a reptilian masquerading as an elderly man. When Grandy called out to Jesus, the reptilian grew obviously angry. He told her that something was put in her head, and if she did not cooperate, it would kill her and that they were the only ones who could stop it. The reptilian told her she was going to die because she would not cooperate. Grandy continued praying and cursing the aliens. In the name of Jesus Christ, I demand you to stop. Jesus will not allow you to touch this child or take him. The reptilian then told Grandy she would die and that they were going to take Ted and keep him regardless of what she said. Grandy told the aliens that for what they had done, they would burn in hell forever. But the alien mocked her saying there is no hell. Grandy continued to tell the reptilian, "You're not going to have our souls." Then she rebuked him in the name of Jesus a third time, and the alien stormed out of the room. At that point one of the Greys brought Ted to the center of the room where Grandy stood. Yet another reptilian appeared seeking to have sex with Grandy, but she resisted with all of her might and mental power. Next they exchanged the reptilian with the image of her dead husband, and, his time, Grandy no longer resisted and submitted to sexual intercourse with the image. Clearly the drugs had taken effect. Then two other beings raped her, but by this time she was unconscious. One of the aliens sodomized Ted, and then the aliens forced Ted to have sex with his grandmother also. Ted recalled crying out to his grandmother, as he lied immobilized. His hands and feet were clamped down by strong elastic bindings. The reptilian who had stormed out early was now back and talking about Ted's being and the other group that had abducted him. Ted was not aware of this other group, unless it was a reference to another group of aliens, perhaps the ones from the previous abduction where cloning took place. Ted believes that the reptilian wanted their souls and that, in spite of her humiliation, Grandy protected him. It was after this incident that the reptilian told Grandy she would die for her disobedience, because Ted belonged to them. When she came back to awareness, Grandy was enraged for allowing herself to be tricked. The aliens persisted in their attempt to plant a false post-hypnotic control, specifically trying to trick her into thinking she would be given the power to heal with herbs, if she would only cooperate with them. The morning after this frightening and humiliating encounter, Ted asked his grandmother, "Who was that man talking in the room last night?" Grandy sat on the kitchen chair slumped over, in exhaustion. Hugging him, she softly said, "It's the devil, honey, just the devil, forget about it." Grandy was nervous, upset, and demanded to be taken home that same day. It was an unusual request because Grandy lived 3 hours away, but the following day the family drove together to Grandy's farm. While still unpacking, Grandy suffered a sudden stroke and died without a sound. Her sudden death added greatly to Ted's misery. Ted's third abduction, a love-bite bonding. When Ted reached puberty, he experienced another traumatic alien abduction involving a girl he knew at school. He was 14 and remembered only that he and the girl were taken away, by what he thought to be angels. He recalls a soft bluish light pervaded his bedroom as two small humanoid beings appeared through the wall facing him. Immobilized, Ted found himself floating between two beings dressed in flowing robes as they escorted him through the wall. The trio flew to a deserted schoolyard about a half-block away. In the distance Ted saw two more angels approaching them with a girl between them. He recognized the girl from school. Her name was Jill. A big UFO sat on the schoolyard lawn, enveloped in the same blue foggy light. Ted and Jill were escorted into the ship where they soon saw a lineup of several children of roughly the same age. Boys and girls seemed to be represented equally. Ted was in a daze, but remembered seeing familiar compartments, chests of drawers or lockers with bodies in them in the back of the ship, like in his previous abduction. At the time Ted thought the aliens were angels. This came out many years later during a hypnotic regression session. Perhaps this angelic vision helped him to deaden the pain of the horror he had witnessed. At one point in the encounter Ted recalled being paired up face to face with Jill. She was just as dazed and bewildered as he. As the angels positioned them, one alien stepped between holding an instrument shaped like a candy cane. Ted remembers the alien using this instrument to manipulate Jill's auric energy field. Ted could see his and Jill's body energy as the alien focused the cane on Jill's heart and chest area. Some of the energy seemed to be clinging to the tool as it was brought toward Ted. Next the alien took that same tool, still irradiated by Jill's auric energy, and placed it within Ted's heart energy field. The alien specialist repeated this process several times. It was as if the essence of Jill's heart energy was being extracted and mixed carefully with Ted's. For some reason the alien did not reverse the process. He did not place any of Ted's heart essence into Jill. During this process, a voice sounded in Ted's mind, "We have merged your souls." Note, as we shall see later on, this one-way love-bite procedure, which appeared to be the transference of heart and soul energy, resulted in a one-sided love obsession. There were about a dozen other children and some adults on the ship undergoing the same pairing procedure. It was not until the next day, at school, that Ted remembered the incident with Jill and the angels. The moment he saw Jill, he felt a rush of emotion as strong as a physical jolt. Just days prior, Ted would not have given her a second thought, but now he adored her. When the partial memory returned, Ted somehow knew he and Jill had been marked by the aliens to be with one another. Surely, he thought, Jill must remember and feel this too. Ted was wrong. Jill made no notice of him. He pursued her obsessively, yet Jill didn't seem to care about his burning love. Ted was crushed. The love bite was successful, as far as the aliens were concerned. Ted turned 14 during this period and all of the normal adolescent juices were flowing. As his love-bitten obsession progressed, he soon lost interest in his schoolwork and outside activities. He tried his best to draw Jill to him and win her over, but to no avail. Ted ached grievously for Jill, but all she gave him in return was a casual friendship. He agonized as he watched her flirting with other boys. Seeing her go out on dates with upper-class men ate him up inside. One day, in desperation, Ted tried to get Jill to talk about that night in the schoolyard. "Don't you remember?" Ted asked, "how the angels put our souls together? How could you forget it?" Jill became irritated and said, "Stop it. Don't talk about such crazy things. That's too weird." Ted pleaded for her to try to remember and understand, but Jill became angry and eventually fearful. After that, Ted never mentioned the angel incident again. The aftermath. Ted managed to date sporadically throughout his high school years, but beneath the mask Ted was lonely, and heartbroken. Jill was the only girl he ever really loved. After he turned 18 and entered college, his sadness was granted a reprieve. He managed to turn on the charm enough to obtain a summer job at a posh resort near Sun Valley, Idaho. He enjoyed the resort atmosphere so much he decided to take a break from college and continued to work there through several winter seasons. But it wasn't long until Jill came back into his life. Unexpectedly, Jill paid Ted a surprise visit at the resort and decided to stay longer than intended. Ted was overjoyed. Her casual friendliness changed to a more serious romantic affection. She latched onto Ted as if they were boyfriend and girlfriend, and soon they were sleeping together. Nothing could have made Ted happier. He was on cloud nine. He finally had the girl of his dreams, and maybe they were meant to be together forever after all. Note, Ted had temporarily transcended the obsession, but he was now being drawn back into the relationship engineered by the aliens. He never thought to ask what compelled Jill to seek him out in Idaho. Is this a coincidence, or did the aliens interfere with Jill again? The newly matched couple went out dancing almost every night. Jill had the enthusiasm and energy of a young child. She could outdrink and outdance Ted, and he soon began to tire of the nightclub scene. Ted now saw a superficial side to Jill's personality and began to remember his brooding sadness. He wisely began passing up the nightly outings and began to stay home. He was, after all, in line for a management position. It wasn't long until Ted found Jill sleeping around with his friends. Ted was humiliated, angry and terribly hurt. She didn't love him and he knew it. The aliens seemed to have had a field day with this couple, but Ted still couldn't deal with his submerged memories. In his opinion, all Jill cared about was having a good time. He couldn't understand why she drank so heavily or why their relationship ended in a disaster. Somewhere in the back of his mind he got the idea that they were meant for one another. He knew it in his soul. Why would the angels do this to him? How could God work with angels who made such a messy mistake? Ted was devastated by Jill's betrayal. He kept his distance from her until she moved back to college. Ted absorbed himself in work and began to heal by taking frequent solitary mountain hikes. During one of these hikes he met a mysterious, dark-haired woman named Maya. She claimed to live in the nearby mountains and worked at Sun Valley Lodge. She seemed to know Ted on a soul level and was very wise for her age. She asked Ted many questions that directed him to think about spiritual and metaphysical concepts. Maya played the role of Sarir Mystica, an otherworldly muse that propelled him into a newfound interest in the paranormal realm. Ted and Maya shared a deep spiritual friendship. He loved her, but realized it wasn't the same kind of passion and love he had for Jill. Maya had a compelling way of interacting. The effects of her words had the force of a command. She talked Ted into going back to college, and soon Ted had a strong desire to go back home. He quit his resort job and packed his things. Before leaving, Ted wanted to say one last goodbye to his friends, and of course Maya. He searched and searched for Maya, asking his work associates if they had seen her. To his surprise, no one had ever seen Maya and did not acknowledge that a Maya even worked at Sun Valley Lodge. According to the personnel office, no employee named Maya or anyone answering to her description ever worked there. Ted was stunned. Was Maya an angel? An apparition? Several months after returning to Alabama, Ted realized that even though he had been hurt in his relationship with Jill, he had forgiven her. He was still in love with her. They met again and eventually got back together and lived together near her college. Their relationship was predictably tumultuous, but in spite of the acrimony it lasted 11 years. Jill seemed to have internal unresolved issues with something she did not understand. Ted was still in denial and didn't see the relationship between the childhood mating abductions and the troubles he was having with Jill. She developed a deepening drinking problem and cheated on Ted often. Ted and Jill broke up and got back together many times. But eventually Ted could not take it. In retrospect, he realized that the relationship was set up to be a disaster from the beginning, and he suffered miserably. To this day he can't understand why the aliens set him up in a love relationship that just about destroyed two people. The breakdown. Ted broke down from the stress of his relationship with Jill. To top it off, he began having an increase in psychic activity and prophetic dreams that frightened him. In an attempt to understand his experiences, he joined a spiritualist group who helped him to use, rather than be afraid of, his newfound psychic abilities. Ted discovered that he had many spirit guides who gave him accurate information on a number of topics. This was so accurate that Ted began to act as a psychic reader for others. After he joined the psychic group, Ted opened up to several visitations from spirit guides. One of these guides, calling himself Valmo, seemed to be the leader, but, as Ted discovered many years later, this Valmo was really a reptilian, posing as a benevolent spirit. Oddly enough, none of these visiting spirits mentioned alien encounters or UFO sightings. Through this intensified relationship, Ted received accurate and reliable information when it came to his psychic readings for other people, but when it came to insights into his own visions and his disturbing spirit visits, he got nothing. Ted asked his group, "Now why is Valmo so outer-directed? Am I blocking something out?" His spiritualist friends offered the usual explanations and platitudes. "Our spirit guides are highly advanced and are here to steer us away from harm. They are helping you in your spiritual development. If the extraterrestrials can travel that far and have such superior intelligence and technology, they must be here for our benefit." This turned out to be completely false and very naive. Even though Ted felt confident about using his psychic abilities, he soon again became depressed and physically exhausted. His worn-down state led to a very serious mental breakdown accompanied by obsessive suicidal ideation. It was at this point in his life that Ted started questioning everything, including his nocturnal visitations from his spirit guides. During these intense soul-searching moments, Ted's friends offered channeled advice from their own spirit guides. On one occasion, a spirit guide explicitly told Ted not to worry about the night with the fog and the being that jolted him with a light wand, an obvious abduction. Others tried to pull him away from such fearful things and told him not to dwell on the negative aspects of his experience. "Just trust that it's all for your spiritual well-being," they told him. Ted plunged back into his psychic work, despite his inner voice telling him something was askew. He still could not face the reality of his abduction, This denial forced him into a state of exhaustion and he wound up on disability. Throughout these years Ted felt like a vagabond, being directed from one place to another by the so-called spirit guides. Throughout his wanderings from Alabama to New Mexico, Texas and Louisiana, Ted stayed in touch with his psychic elders. All the while Ted continued to have fragmented memories of his boyhood abductions and flashbacks about Jill and Maya. In one flashback, while Ted was in New Mexico, he recalled seeing a group of abductees being corralled into an underground facility, led by gray aliens. This brought back deeply repressed images. Ted blamed himself and harbored guilt about Grandy's death. He also experienced difficulties with female relationships and avoided contacts with women. This forced him to seek help from clinical professionals who understand the abduction phenomenon, and his life has been significantly improved since then. It was at this time that Ted met Barbara Bartholic, an abductions researcher and hypnotherapist. Ted underwent a series of hypnotic regressions, which uncovered layers of repressed alien abduction memories. During those sessions Ted realized the connection between his spirit guides and the reptilian named Valmo. He also discovered the elaborate deceptions and manipulations that encompassed his entire life, his psychic work and his abductions. Now with the blinders off, Ted could see how the aliens masqueraded as benevolent spirit guides offering psychic messages and perks designed to steer people away from the obvious dark side of the abduction phenomena. In his own words, Ted confessed, "In my prayers I have openly confessed to God that I have been molded, shaped and engineered to be a light worker they wanted me to be. I have been in preparation for 40 years to do just what I've been doing, which is fascinating and mystifying people with my remarkable abilities. Through psychic readings, I have led people away from the Christ consciousness into a world of metaphysics and ufology. I overpowered people mentally and left them wide open to invite this invading nightmare into their lives. And I did it all under the illusion and deception that I was really and truly helping my fellow man grow spiritually wiser through my so-called gifts. Now, I've asked God to take this ability they have engineered within me and use it against them to reveal their plans and secrets. May God give us the strength and power to overcome their evil." Over a decade after discovering his abduction memories, Ted has integrated his past traumas and accepts the wisdom his life has taught him. Through years of support and with the aid of hypnosis, Ted has been able to move forward with a new sense of self-esteem and personal victory. Chapter 5: The Linda Cortile Case. When Bud Hopkins' book, Witnessed, first appeared, everyone concerned took notice, but Hopkins only scratched the surface. This historical UFO abduction case is extraordinary because it drew in several high-ranking government employees and a foreign dignitary of unimpeachable status. It also demonstrates how, even the most noble, motives can be perverted by the alien strategy. On November 30, 1989 at 3:00 a.m., Linda Cortile, a 40-year-old wife and mother, was abducted by alien beings out of her 12th-story Manhattan apartment in full view of three men parked in an official government car on the street below. 3,000 miles to the west, millions of people were still digging out from San Francisco's worst earthquake in almost a century. In Oklahoma and the Southwest, the greatest swarm of UFO sightings ever recorded had just ended. Richard and Dan, two of the men who witnessed Linda's abduction, were on assignment as security agents for a high-ranking foreign political leader who sat in the car with them. As the agents were driving on their way back from a late United Nations event, they were forced to pull over near FDR Drive on South Catherine Slip. They stopped because they saw a woman in a white gown floating effortlessly outside of her window in a fetal position. She was surrounded by a bluish-white light. Using binoculars, they saw her escorted into a hovering UFO by three small gray aliens who flew next to her like pixies without wings. Richard, Dan and the VIP took frantic turns looking through the field glasses at the surrealistic scene above. The diplomat went hysterical in the back seat and had to be calmed down. In a few minutes the UFO shot up into the air, then just as suddenly, turned and took an angular dive into the East River, at Pier 17, near the Brooklyn Bridge. Shaken, the three men waited 45 minutes for the UFO to emerge from the water, but it never did. They did not know at the time that they too had been abducted. When she was taken into the spacecraft, Linda Cortile was a beautiful Gallo-Roman brunette, married to a traditional Italian man named Steve. In 1989, Steve and Linda were proud to take their two boys, Steve Jr. and Johnny, to elementary school every day, but shortly after Linda was abducted, their entire life began to crash down around them. The day after her abduction, she could not remember how she returned home, or what, exactly, happened to her, but she knew that she had been abducted. In an attempt to get answers, she contacted Bud Hopkins because she knew he was an expert and would be able to be of assistance. To her amazement, he called back immediately and agreed to interview her soon thereafter. Eventually, Hopkins was able to verify Linda's ordeal by interviews with other eyewitnesses, but nothing filtered through to the media right away. Winter passed, then a full year, and the 80s passed into the 90s. The planet Earth kept its grinding orbit, and yet Linda was still vexed by the abduction. It wasn't until February of 1991 that Bud received a letter from Richard and Dan, detailing their version of the abduction on that same night in November. Before that letter, Hopkins and Linda had no idea the event had even been witnessed, let alone witnessed by two G-men and a high-ranking political figure. Hopkins called Linda and told her about the letter. In it, the two security guards described themselves as over 40, with more than 40 years' experience in security work between them. They said they were in the process of investigating Linda Cortile and specifically mentioned the November 30, 1989 incident. Hopkins figured they must have been there because their account agreed with Linda's in almost every detail. The date and hour matched, the eerie blue light was precisely described, as was the UFO craft, the floating apparition, the sleeping or fetal posture, and the three accompanying grays. In fact, the two men included everything but an aerial perspective. In the letter, the two men apologized for taking so much time to respond, and explained that they were nervous about the incident. They said they were drawn to Hopkins because he had written the book entitled Intruders, and also his first book, Missing Time, and that, in all of their experience, they were not prepared for what they had witnessed. Hopkins had seen it before. These two tough guys were not comfortable reporting on a UFO, especially one they witnessed. Their pride as law enforcement officers and military men was at stake. They stressed that they wanted to maintain their anonymity, especially since Uncle Sam tends to frown on UFO sightings. They debated various courses of action for 15 months and finally decided to contact somebody knowledgeable, but definitely not aligned with the government. Bud Hopkins fit the bill. In the letter, Richard expressed a profound guilt about not being able to stop Linda's abduction. Working together with Dan, and, surprisingly, with the urging of the foreign VIP, the two agents made great efforts to locate Linda. To do this, they tracked down the apartment by counting the windows on the outside of the building. Then they canvassed her neighbors and made discreet inquiries. From December of 1989 to the time the letter was written, either Dan or Richard, or someone they enlisted, kept Linda under surveillance. They wanted to contact her for questioning, both out of curiosity and probably to lessen their own anxiety, but they decided to recruit Hopkins to make the connection for them. Dan was aggressive, but Richard didn't want to come on like a stormtrooper. At the time, neither Richard, Dan nor the third man knew they too had been abducted on the morning of the 30th of November, but they were all growing queasy about the event in their own way. Although their memories of this mutual abduction were still submerged, all three men were strongly compelled to find Linda. Richard began to believe that Linda was the woman of his childhood dreams, the one he had secretly been in love with all of his life. Dan was less romantic, more politically motivated, and assumed Linda must have been a spook for a foreign service. The diplomat was far more objective, but wanted updates nonetheless. 2 weeks after the February 1991 letter, Richard and Dan paid Linda a visit at her apartment, posing as two undercover Manhattan police officers. Their questions revealed how really in the dark they were. They persisted in the belief that Linda was in on some kind of publicity gag or hoax, At least that was the impression they gave. I guess they could not face the truth at that time. Linda, who at that point remembered very little other than the fact that she was abducted, felt the two men were rather awkward. They thought it was a colossal magic trick, perhaps a rehearsal for a stage show. "How did you float through the window?" they asked. Did she remember it? Was she hurt in any way? Dan was nervous and emotionally distant. Richard, who was set up to be the romantic rescuer, maintained a sense of warmth and respect. They seemed to be playing out the old good cop, bad cop roles they learned at the Law Enforcement Academy. She was shocked at first. She had no idea anyone else even knew about the case, but she went along on Bud Hopkins' recommendation. Hopkins tells us that without admitting what they saw, Dan asked, "How did you do that? How did you manage to get outside the building?" Linda answered that she did not know, but urged him to believe her when she said she did not ask to be abducted. Richard said nothing and looked, according to Linda, as if he were going to cry. Linda overheard Richard muttering to himself as he covered his face with his hands, "It's her, oh my God, it's her." This would turn out to be a very significant comment. Richard, acting on his own, followed Linda for several days. This time he planned to bump into her after Sunday Mass outside of St. Patrick's Cathedral, with her husband occupied elsewhere. Again, according to Hopkins, Richard took Linda aside apologizing for Dan's cold attitude. He also expressed his protective and chivalrous interest in Linda. He added that Dan had to take a leave of absence from work because of the stress of the UFO incident and what they had discovered. This comment would later turn out to be a self-fulfilling prophecy. At that point Linda realized that Dan and Richard had, actually, witnessed the abduction from the boulevard below her apartment. She did not, at that time, know about the third witness in the car. Richard took the opportunity to ask Linda for a few pointers on how to send a tape of his version of the abduction to Bud Hopkins. This was probably a non sequitur, but he wanted to create a channel of communication with her. He was looking for any excuse to see Linda again. Signs of his obsession with Linda were beginning to show, but Linda did not see these comments as a threat at that time. In my opinion, Richard's alien-induced love bite was starting to take hold. In March of 1991, Hopkins received Richard's tape of his version of the abduction event, although at this time, Richard had not yet experienced the flashbacks that would astonish everyone. Only later in the saga, after several letters to Bud Hopkins and other debriefings, was it discovered that the three men were also abducted, whisked out of their government vehicle just as Linda was being drawn into the craft engulfed in the light beam, their memories subsequently clouded by powerful, alien mind control techniques. This revelation led to the discovery of the Lady of the Sands beach scene that was reconstructed during Linda's hypnotic sessions. The disoriented government officers and the third man, individually, without coaching, and at different times, remembered seeing themselves sitting on a sandy beach, perhaps somewhere like Fire Island, as Linda and several aliens walked on the beach. The macrocephalic creatures carried pails with lights on them and shovels as they and Linda dug small holes in the sand. They looked as if they were collecting samples, but samples of what? What would the aliens need with sand? All three men heard Linda speaking to the creatures in an exotic language, as if she was one of them. The aliens were silent and seemed to be taking orders, as if Linda, still dressed in her nightgown, was their boss. Linda recalls seeing the three men, sitting dazed on the cold beach in tailored suits. She walked up to them, picked up a dead fish and with tears and anger in her eyes she said, "Look what you have done." Each man reports hearing Linda say this exact phrase telepathically, not aloud. The meaning of this harangue remains a mystery, but Hopkins offers an environmental motivation by the aliens. Richard asked her, "Who are you?" Linda didn't answer, but aliens answered telepathically, "Lady of the Sands." Dan, the most insecure of the three men, instinctively tried to reach for his pistol while sitting on the beach, but his arms were paralyzed by Linda's powerful stare. Her apparent ability to restrict him awakened in him feelings of anger, suspicion and paranoia. Was this some sort of Freudian reaction? Was Dan processing deeply repressed psychological material? Perhaps. Richard entertained friendly thoughts toward her, and her family, something one may consider incongruent considering the circumstances. The third man, a very powerful person in private life as well as in his own government, harbored a confused amazement about the incident and vowed, as soon as he recovered his senses, to keep Linda under constant surveillance by his own private security force. Unbeknownst to Linda or Hopkins, Richard, Dan and the third man all experienced dream-like flashbacks of the abduction on several occasions. Even more bizarre was the fact that all three recalled the beach scene within 2 days of one another, many miles apart, after more than a year of silence, and each decided to write the letter to Hopkins as a method of reaching out to Linda. This was far beyond coincidence. Had the aliens deliberately switched on these emotionally laden men for a specific reason? Each man was now focused on Linda in their own unique manner. Richard was growing obsessive, Dan was patently afraid of her, and the foreign VIP, while concerned for security reasons, seemed to be harboring avuncular or grandfatherly feelings toward her children. All three men worried that she might be involved on some kind of secret project sponsored by, yet another, foreign government. Was she part alien? How could she speak that strange language and communicate telepathically with her small gray companions? Richard's tape proved extremely helpful to Hopkins, but Dan's method of revelation was a bit more direct. On April 4, near the time the three men started having their abduction flashbacks, Dan sent Hopkins an unsolicited letter. The letter seemed erratic and carried a dangerously negative charge. Dan was clearly depressed and tenaciously determined to find out more about Linda's questionable background. Dan could not bring himself to see Linda as a simple victim or pawn in the game. By this time, Linda had questions of her own concerning the true identity of Richard and Dan. Hopkins, using his contacts in the police force, proceeded with his own investigations and determined that the two were not police officers at all. Not only that, but Linda had become aware of being under surveillance, both by Dan and Richard and by other shadowy figures trailing her, possibility in the service of the VIP official. Naturally, Hopkins began to worry that Linda might be in physical danger. In a later correspondence, Richard admits to the same concerns. More importantly, Linda had not yet told her husband of her suspicions. Once confronted by Hopkins, the two agents admitted to the deception. They apologized and claimed that the cover-up was designed to protect the sensitive nature of their government jobs. They implied that their superiors knew nothing of the incident. But they also admitted to working for a third man who had also witnessed Linda's abduction with them. Hopkins naturally asked the identity of this mystery man, but the agents refused to reveal it, claiming that national security might be compromised due to the high level of the third man's political position. A month went by. Linda was growing increasingly agoraphobic, her anxiety on the rise. She prayed a lot and was losing sleep. She went out only when necessary and was reluctant to tell her husband or kids about the incidents. This internalization is part and parcel of most abductions, alien or otherwise, and is common in rape and molestation cases. The victim is just too embarrassed to tell anyone. But the worst was yet come. On April 29, 1991, Richard and Dan kidnapped Linda one morning after she dropped off her youngest son, Johnny, at the bus stop. Richard had mixed feelings about this covert action, especially since they were probably working entirely on their own time and in consort with the third man. But Dan, in his paranoid fashion, insisted they get to the bottom of it. Richard went along with the plan out of a sense of duty and an underlying need to protect Linda. They drove by in a black Mercedes sedan, as she walked home after escorting her son to the school bus. The car was, I suspect, provided by the embassy of the high-ranking third party, since American operatives almost never use foreign-made vehicles. Both men ordered her to step into the car. Dan drove, as Richard got out of the back seat and grabbed Linda, kicking and screaming, right off the street. It happened so smoothly, it was obvious to Linda that these two men were professionals and had done this before. Linda put up a good fight, trying to kick out the back window, but it proved to be made of bulletproof glass. The interrogation began as they sped off with Linda screaming in the back seat. No one saw the event, except perhaps agents for the third man who undoubtedly listened to tape recordings of the interrogation later. It was well timed. Linda thrashed about until Dan, in his usual brusque manner, threatened to knock her out. Seeing that resistance was futile, Linda eventually calmed down, but she remained argumentative. She expressed disappointment in Richard. She thought he, at least, was a good guy. This hurt him, but there was no turning back now. They pulled into a tree-lined area. The few pedestrians walking by could not see through the tinted windows and the car was soundproofed anyway. According to what Hopkins could piece together, the interrogation proceeded as Dan shot out questions as orders: who are you working for, what government agency? Linda maintained her innocence. The interrogation shifted to the abduction event, as Dan and Richard asked Linda about the blue-white light, and how she got out of the apartment window. She had no idea and claimed, over and over again, that she was taken against her will and could not remember anything. Satisfied that she was telling the truth, the two professional agents eventually relaxed enough to tell Linda about what they saw, and how they felt powerless to stop the abduction. The tide was turning in Linda's favor. Neither man apologized for taking her off the street and she was justifiably defensive. According to Linda, hearing someone else talk in detail about her own abduction had a chilling effect. It's one thing to think aliens abducted you, but when others confirm it, the reality can be too much to bear. As Richard and Dan described how they saw her suspended in the beam of light with the aliens in full view, she started to break down and cry. Richard seemed to be satisfied that she was telling the truth, but Dan was not at all satisfied with her answers. Again, according to Hopkins, Dan yelled at Linda with renewed anger, "Oh, shut your face. Stop crying. You're in full agreement with them. You did exactly what they told you to do." Richard, sensing Linda's emotional pain, came to her rescue. "Don't say that, you don't know what was happening. How can you say that to her?" Playing his bad cop role to the hilt, Dan kept pounding away at Linda. "You're one of them, aren't you?" Linda shook her head in denial. But Dan wasn't convinced and hammered her mercilessly. "Don't hand me that shit, you are one of them." Infuriated, Linda lunged for Dan, pulling his hair. Another struggle ensued and Richard had to break them up. Dan's paranoid accusations continued, but Richard was no longer playing good cop. He was now very worried. He knew Dan was armed with a .45 APC and there was a can of mace in the glove box. "I still think you are one of them, you have their blood." Dan never explained what he meant or why he said those exact words, but clearly it seemed connected to some deep-seated racist issues he harbored. They argued back and forth until Dan requested that Linda take her shoes off. He wanted to see her feet. Linda refused, until Richard assured her that was all they would ask of her. Why would they want to see Linda's feet? Reluctantly, Linda took off her shoes and socks. Dan lifted one foot and examined it, scrutinizing her ankle, the underside of her foot and all of her toes. Unsatisfied, Dan examined her other foot. After a few remarks between them, Richard casually said to Linda, "You're such a sweet kid." Linda shot back, "Stop treating me like a kid." Richard responded tenderly, "I wish you were mine." Dan finally gave up his foot exam. Whatever he was looking for wasn't there, or was it? Linda broke off the podiatry lesson by trying to crack a joke. "You've seen one, you've seen them all." Although they tried to make light of the foot exam, both men were in fact looking for something specific, a mark, an implant, or some evidence of an alien hybrid perhaps. Dan pointed to Linda's heel and nodded. Richard said, "You're right." He smiled in agreement as he looked over the front seat. "I can see it." See what? Linda didn't understand. As if the foot request wasn't enough, Richard asked Linda for a hug. This is an ancient interrogation technique designed to resolve residual anger in the victim. It would normally signal forgiveness on the part of the victim, but it only made Linda sick. Dan seconded the request. Now this was getting weird, Linda thought. She avoided the bizarre request, and asked Richard why he wanted a hug. He said he needed one and that was all he could say. She noticed Richard had tears in his eyes, but what on earth for? Linda didn't think either man deserved a hug. She gave her sons hugs, her husband too, but these guys, what were they thinking? She made excuses to avoid hugging them. Her dignity was at stake, but Richard begged her as he wormed his way closer. Linda was surprised to see Richard crying. She decided to hug him first, just to stay in control of the situation. She put her arms around Richard's neck, with her head on his shoulder, facing Dan. Afterward, Linda pulled away, but Richard did not let her go, wanting to hold on longer. Then Richard pressed Linda's cheeks between his hands and kissed her lightly on the nose, saying, "I wish you were my little girl." That was about enough for Linda and she pulled herself away with a jerk. The conversation gradually changed to more trivial questions, until the two obsessed men finally dropped Linda off at the same bus stop. As they let Linda out, Richard said, "I'll see you okay?" Finally free and preparing to run. If necessary, Linda saucily fired back her answer, "No you won't. Not if I can help it." She left immediately hoping never to see them again. She knew she couldn't call the cops, but she did call Bud Hopkins. She looked at her watch, and saw that she had been gone for over 2.5 hours. That night she felt she had to tell her husband something. So she softened the facts and told him about her abduction and about her kidnapping earlier that day. Steve went ballistic at the dinner table, dropping her delicately prepared veal scallopini and dishes all over the floor. The two boys were so frightened they went and hid in their rooms. Later it was understood that Steve had bad feelings that something was going wrong with Linda, but could not bring himself to ask her about it. He too was chivalrous toward her and felt bad because he could do nothing to help. Steve's reaction also fits a pattern. Many husbands of abductees feel bad, not only because their wives were taken, but because they were not around to prevent the act in the first place. This is also common in rape cases. In spite of her protests, Richard and Dan did not intend to leave Linda alone. In May, the following month, they attempted to snatch Linda again. The same black Mercedes was spotted, but this time the third man was watching the whole incident from afar. This time Linda ran off before they had a chance to seize her and was able to escape the kidnap attempt. A full summer went by without incident, but Linda was fearful the whole time. Her family life was not going smoothly. That fall, Bud Hopkins received another radical letter from Dan. In it Dan detailed the Lady of the Sands incident for the first time. This one blew the top off the case. The three men who witnessed Linda's abduction had finally come to realize that they too were abducted on November 30, 1989. The tone of his letter indicated Dan was markedly depressed, anxious, angry and in a borderline state. He made ambiguous love/hate comments about Linda, as if he too was falling in love with her, albeit in his own deranged manner. On October 15, 1991, Linda was again violently kidnapped by Dan, who was now acting alone. He chased Linda down the street, managed to confuse and grab her and throw her into a red Jaguar XJ6 sports car with the top down. This must have been his own car because he drove it with one hand like a professional driver, all the while holding Linda down with the other. He accelerated to speeds of over 60 miles per hour on city streets, fast enough to discourage anyone from bailing out. Once he maneuvered her into a dark alley. Dan's racist upbringing again flashed out. He continued to refer to Linda as a half-breed, and sloppily kissed her all over her face after pinning her down on the seat. Linda kicked back and tried to bite him. Rebuffed and now feeling guilty, the crazed agent drove Linda to an isolated beach house on Long Island. This was probably a special safe house used by New York area security agents for various covert operations. As soon as they walked into the house, Dan handed Linda a white gift box. She opened the box to find a diaphanous nightgown and negligee similar to the one she was wearing the night she was abducted from her 12th-story apartment. "I want to take some pictures just to make sure it was really you that night." Dan seemed apologetic as he spoke. She refused to put the gown on, but finally compromised by putting the white nightgown on over her clothes. As she walked across the room wearing the white gown, Dan fell to his knees, his eyes transfixed above, arms outstretched as if in a mystical trance. He was truly losing his sanity now, vacillating between his cold and violent need to control women and a love-crazed awe for Linda, as if she is an angel, or the white goddess herself. Taking advantage of Dan's moment of weakness, Linda ran for the door. Within a few steps she hit the beach and continued to run. As the door slammed shut, Dan abruptly came to his senses and chased Linda, catching up with her, knocking her down in the water. Dan acted as if he was taken over by another entity, dunking her head in the water, then telling her to go and dig holes on the beach like he saw her do with the aliens, during the witnessed abduction. Linda fought for her life to get away from him, but he kept knocking her down on the wet sand. He unzipped her pants beneath the completely soaked white gown, yanked her jeans down, forced her down and tried to rape her. But instead of raping her, he held her close, cradling her in his arms, rocking back and forth like an autistic child in a hopeless need of love. He mumbled about taking her off to a faraway country to marry her and start a new life and family. By this time, Richard had arrived, aghast at what he was seeing in his totally deranged partner. Aware of Dan's unpredictable violence, Richard gently started a conversation to get Linda back to the beach house safely. The original plan was for Richard and Dan to take Linda to the beach house for further questioning, but Dan took advantage of the situation and kidnapped Linda hours before, deliberately leaving Richard out of the picture. This was not supposed to happen. Richard was furious, but hid his emotions until he had control of the situation. Richard sent Dan upstairs to shower, and spoke to him as one would a child, getting him out of the way. Richard came to Linda's rescue just in the nick of time. He drove her home, as she fell asleep exhausted, neither one exchanging a word between them. A month later Richard paid Linda a friendly visit, apologizing for the ordeal she had to endure with Dan. He reassured her that Dan had been put under psychiatric care, in a rest home and would no longer be contacting her. Dan was forced to retire on permanent disability. Richard also confessed his feelings for Linda, letting her know that his connection to her extended beyond just witnessing the November abduction event 2 years before. But at the time, Linda didn't understand. Neither did she know that Dan was determined to kidnap her again, if he had the chance. In November 1991, Hopkins received a confessional letter. In it Richard described long repressed dreams he recalled having as a boy of 10. The dreams focused on a girl, younger than Richard, who he nicknamed Baby Ann. In the dreams Baby Ann was escorted specifically to play with Richard, by tall, emotionless men who Richard believed were aliens. Most of the time Richard and Baby Ann were left alone to play in a private room. Sometimes they were supervised, but most of the time they were observed, he felt, from a distance or through some kind of observation screen. He described the playroom as an almost clinical and brightly lit environment, with no chairs or tables and few, if any, toys. Richard thought he was in love with the girl and that the feeling was mutual. Whenever the men brought Baby Ann, she would run to him, delighted to see him. But, as soon as they began to have fun the aliens would take her away again, leaving Richard sad, and with his hands in his pockets. Baby Ann nicknamed Richard, Mickey. While they played they tried to remember each other's real names and addresses, but were prevented from remembering specific details by a wave of forgetfulness. Richard's bonding dreams recurred every 6 months until he was about 15. At that age a sexual bonding occurred. Richard remained in love with the girl of his dreams throughout his teens and even into adulthood. Her image was burned into his soul. It was as if he went around with a template applied to every woman he knew to see if she fit the baby and pattern. In that November letter, Richard added a shocking revelation. Hopkins stood amazed as he read it. Richard was now convinced that Linda Cortile was baby Ann and that she and Richard had been abducted as children and teenagers and bonded by the aliens. This did a lot to explain his love obsession with Linda. Richard told Bud Hopkins he distinctly recalled vivid dreams about an abduction and sexual bonding that took place when he and Linda were adults in 1981. Richard was convinced that Linda's younger son, Johnny, was really his. Johnny was born in 1982, within the 9-month gestation time frame of the 1981 orchestrated liaison and possible abduction. Linda realized later, through questioning and hypnosis, that Mickey, her childhood imaginary playmate, was none other than Richard. This knowledge also increased Linda's feelings for Richard, but she could not act on her feelings. She was happily married to another man. We can now see that Richard was the one the aliens chose to be obsessed and unrequited. A one-sided love bite was all part of the plan. But for what purpose? Was this process designed for the aliens' amusement? Was this drama staged for the third man, an important foreign political leader who watched the whole incident unfold? We can't be sure, but we know the VIP took a keen interest in the case. This mystery man finally corresponded by letter to Bud Hopkins and admitted to his involvement in Linda's surveillance. But he also admitted to a special connection with Johnny, Linda and Steve's youngest son. It turns out the foreign official recalled being taken by the aliens in a mutual abduction scenario with Johnny. He developed a grandfatherly love for Johnny and had many dreams about him. It was discovered later through hypnosis, that little Johnny, Linda, another young girl and the third man were all abducted on the same evening, by the same crew. In this event the neighbor and the third man witnessed Johnny and the young girl being placed together, in some kind of childhood bonding procedure. They recalled watching helplessly as the aliens placed the two children together, then took them away from each other as soon as they began to have fun. This seems very much like the ritual bonding that took place between Richard and Linda when they were little. For reasons he did not understand, the diplomat felt compelled to make Johnny Cortile his mission in life. He remembers giving Johnny a diving helmet to cheer him up one day after the anonymous little girl was taken away. All of the lives in the story were significantly changed after Linda Cortile's UFO abduction in Manhattan, on November 30, 1989. From what Linda has recently told me, Richard still contacts her twice a year, for Christmas and birthdays. She is not sure if Richard still feels the same way as he did in the past, but admits that there are times when she can sense his presence nearby. The Cortile case demonstrated that the alien abduction phenomena extends beyond the classic medical exams and UFO sightings. It is clear that the dramas that unfolded surrounding this love bite were arranged by the aliens, and appeared to be fueled by the emotions of the love bite obsession itself.